Hi, my name is Raphael Sbarge.
And I'm Greg Laemmle.
And welcome to another episode of Inside the Arthouse. Today, we're here with a dear friend.
A great humanitarian.
A great humanitarian. Professor, historian, author, and the founder of Cinema Treasures, Ross Melnick, who we met essentially through the executive producer of the film that I made about you, only in theaters. Gary Rubin introduced us, I believe, and said, "There's this great guy, you got to talk to him." And you are a great guy. and you have so much
and a cinema
information.
treasure.
Yeah. And a cinema treasure. You had told me that we are sort of within the range of margin of error, about 100 years of art house. And, while people listening to this may be art house connoisseurs, maybe they're not. And I found it sort of interesting to kind of try and sort of put sharpen our pencil and define what the heck is that? What does that mean? And how do we get here, I guess, as a starting point anyway.
Yeah, well, that's a great starting point. And thanks for having me here. It's great to be with you both and great to be inside this amazing theater. The history of art house theaters is about 100 years old. It really starts around 1925 with Simon Gould and the Film Guild and the beginning of what were then called little cinemas. So the little cinemas grew out of what was called the little theaters. Little theaters were performing arts theaters across the country. There were almost 5,000 of them.
Like vaudeville, kind of?
No, actually, like literally performing arts for plays and performances that were avant-garde, experimental, off of the kind of the mainstream. And there was a growing movement in the 20s to kind of push away from mainstream narratives and to create theaters, legitimate theaters that were for live performances. This is across the country. And so inspired by little theaters, little cinemas grew, sometimes even in previously legitimate houses, to start showing films that were also experimental, avant-garde, and in this case, often foreign. They were sort of growing out of an interest in foreign films. And if you, at the risk of boring you, let me take you back just a few years earlier, which is that World War I happens between 14 and 18. And when it's over, there's a huge anti-German sentiment in the United States. Massive, to say the least.
Yeah.
And no one wants to show German films. The only person that's willing to show a German film is himself a German American, a guy named Samuel Roxy Raphael, who most people know as Roxy, and who, of course, is the person who created Radio City Music Hall. He founded it. He ran the Roxy, the Capitol, the Strand, the Rialto, the Rivoli. All the major movie houses, or many of the major movie houses in New York, were run by Roxy. And when Roxy, underneath Samuel Goldwyn, we'll come back to Samuel Goldwyn later. We talk about a different company that his progeny ran. But when Roxy ran the Capitol Theater, he was really interested in this movie called Madame du Barry. It's an Ernest Lubitsch film, 1919. Roxy saw it and said, "I'm going to bring this movie here." And he took that 9-reel film, he cut it to 6, he made new intertitles and a whole effect, and he released it as Passion. The Capitol Theater in New York was 5,300 seats.
Oh, my God.
So it was the largest theater in the United States. It was also a trade industry darling. It had opened previously under another couple of people, Messmer Kendall and Major Bose. And Roxy was running and thought, I'm going to bring this film. So it broke the unofficial German boycott, the anti-German boycott. And suddenly there was this massive hit of a foreign film. They titled it like a cosmopolitan film. They didn't really tell it was German, but it was called Passion.
And it sold well.
It sold really well. And then he thought, well, I'll bring another movie. And this is where people will start, their ears will start to pick up. A movie called Cabinet Dr. Caligari. Robert Wiene film. That film was also released at the Capitol Theater, not for a small art house, but a 5,300 seat theater. And because it made also a lot of money, it went across the country. And then he also took Nanook of the North, which was one of the first sort of feature-length documentaries that was also being screened. All of these theaters, all these films were shown at this massive theater. So when this art cinema movement comes in the mid-20s, they go back to the films that were really highbrow, that were foreign, that were for the elite audiences, not for the masses. And that film that they started picking out was Cabinet Dr. Caligari and The Nook and Passion and all of these films that had come out of typically Germany, England, France, were suddenly going to be playing in all of these new little cinemas that were growing, especially in New York.
So what the term art house, where does that come from, and where does that get minted?
Well, it's a later term. We're actually early because in the mid-20th century, they were called sure-seaters. And the reason they were called sure-seaters is because in the 30s and early 40s, they were guaranteed to have a seat. And by the time you get to the art house boom in the late 40s and 50s, they were guaranteed those seats would be filled. So the sure-seater movement even predates the art house movement. So there's all these epochs in art house history. And so those first theater, again, under Gould in 25, and then the boom of Cameo and all the other theaters in 26, is where the art house movement really begins, in art house theater movements of film. And in the late 20s, after the success in New York, you start to see art house theaters, or little cinemas back then, in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, LA, you name it. And it's a nationwide movement.
Right. So the films are getting wider distribution.
Yeah,
at that point.
because the foreign films actually have a place, and there are also audiences that see themselves
discerning
as
audience, right?
Discerning audiences. They see themselves as we would call art house audiences.
Yes, and obviously recognize home or recognize the countries that they've come from, et cetera.
Well, but look, I mean, this is silent film. So it's not, when we think of art house cinema, the first thing you think about is subtitles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In this case, it's intertitles, but yes.
But the intertitles, I mean, you know, it was not a language thing necessarily.
Right. And that's why they did so well, because foreign films didn't really matter. They were English subtitles or English intertitles.
You change the intertitles, yeah.
Right. The intertitles are English. So until sound, you could have...
Film was international.
Film was international. Once sound comes in, you now see people who are really interested in film art. And that's really the distinction here, is the notion of film art. And that people saw film as, those people who cared about little cinemas saw film as art, not film as
commerce or
commerce entertainment.
Right. Yeah, because film, I mean, certainly in the very early, pre-World War I, I guess, is, kind of lowbrow.
Yeah, it's made to be a mass medium. It's trying to fill. If you have 5,300 seats, you need something that will appeal to a mass audience. And, and the Roxy was 6,000 seats, and Radio City is almost 6,000 seats. So these were huge theaters. They were atypical. Movie palaces weren't atypical. But neighborhood houses in places like New York were 2,000 seats. So you needed to have films that would play broadly. These were films that were playing more narrowly. And they were films that were by European directors with European sensibility. Sometimes they would have more avant-garde aesthetics, or they would have sensibilities that were not as happy, as didn't need a perfect Hollywood ending. They would have more challenging social and political material to them. And they could be, which is what the little cinemas created, was a place that was for an upscale audience with art on the wall, no popcorn, doling out coffee and cigarettes, a place where you were not allowed to talk in the middle of the movie, but you were encouraged and even demanded in a way to talk before the film.
So it's more like theater in a sense.
It was exactly that idea.
Live theater.
It was exactly that idea. And that same crowd that would go to a Broadway theater were the same crowd that would go to a little cinema. They saw them as the same.
Now, is this trend in the United States? Does it start here, or is it following a European trend, or
it's inspired exactly by the cineclubs of Paris and by the kind of film societies that are growing up out of Europe. So, in the same way that you have influences of the creation of curating and collecting film at MoMA, which is happening in the 30s, coming out of the collecting practices that are happening in Europe, you have this kind of transnational, cosmopolitan interest in film as art. And that place of film as art has a different group of magazines and journals. It's got the National Board of Review. It has people who are interested in thinking about film as art, which is a movement that's pushing people into collecting film. Again, at MoMA and other institutions, it's where, the State Department is starting to think about film as a kind of as a cultural product and as things that we can transport and we can transmit. And so
propaganda.
Film,
right?
Yeah,
yes,
well,
yes,
that's true.
Yes.
But film is taking on a different.
We're getting into your other book here.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We're taking it on a moment of where a self-selected group of people are talking about film in a certain kind of way. This is in the 20s. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't make a huge amount of cash by the time you get to 1930. The audiences want sound, and that means that foreign films are more challenging. But the audience stays with it through the 1930s, during the Depression, and then you have World War II. And it's the same thing. I said, we're sure-seaters, you're guaranteed to find a seat. After World War II, you got to remember that service people are coming back from the war. They've been in the Asian theater. They've been in the European theater. They've been stationed in France. They've been stationed in Italy. They've been in Japan. And they are interested.
They've gone to college, too.
And they've gone to college. And we have a whole generation now, including exhibitors, whose fathers, and this is male-dominated business back then, their fathers didn't go to college, but they all did. right? So Sumner Redstone goes to college, and all these different, Stanley Durwood goes to all the exhibitors of that period. A lot of them are Harvard educated. They come out of college, and coming out of college means they learned about all kinds of culture. That's right,
with a capital K, right?
Right. Culture, right. So they learn about culture, and they now think of film as a place where you can also learn about politics, and you can talk about what's happening in the social world. The other thing that's happening is you have the main films that are making a huge impact are things like Roma Città Aperta, right? So Rossellini's Rome Open City. And that movie makes a ton of money because it's coming at the same time that we're starting to watch films about World War II. We're starting to watch newsreels about World War II. And now people want to see films about World War II because it's resonant. And we want to see films about the effects of that. And so Open City, Paisan, these movies make $1 million. They're playing for sometimes a year or two. So these are not the same kind of theaters where you get 1 week and they're out. They're playing 29 weeks, 48 weeks. They're playing forever. And so it's becoming a different kind of sensibility. And suddenly the same audiences that we kept thinking about in the 20s, now we have the urban audiences, the intellectuals or the self-appointed intellectuals, the elite, and often people with money. Some of these ticket prices are $2. So that's a lot of money.
What was the average ticket price?
50 cents.
Right, okay.
Right, 35 cents. So you're talking about people.
It's like Broadway now. Right?
Yeah, it's a very specific group that's going to this kind of theater. Mm-hmm. And so that whole audience is suddenly realizing, wait, we can find these theaters that have movies that we're interested in, and distributors, even people like MGM, are seeing that there's money to be made in distributing foreign films to increasingly receptive theaters. The other thing that's happening after the war is TV, which means that when television is arising, you have TV news. Well, if I have television news, I don't need newsreel theaters because I can go home and watch the news. So now newsreel theaters are looking for something else to do because the newsreel audiences after the war are declining.
You don't need serials because that's basically TV.
Yeah, you don't need all of these things. What you need is audiences. So Translux, Telenews, these big newsreel chains, these are theaters that just show newsreels all day long. They're declining audiences. Well, what is the perfect product that you can replace an upscale, educated, world-traveling audience with? It's the art house, foreign films. Mm-hmm. So Translux and other chains turn over their theaters basically to art house. So now you have receptive theaters, you've got growing audiences, and remember that a lot of audiences are moving out to the suburbs. The people staying in the cities are, again, the people who are thinking themselves as urbane, elite, intellectual, building that post-war Madison Avenue type, but they have to be even encouraged and entertained and also educated by films that are going to be coming out of, again, Japan, France, Germany, you name it.
I mean, this is sort of an exercise in sort of follow the money, isn't it? I mean, basically it's one, and that's still the case. But I mean, obviously, these trends obviously were defined by their enthusiastic response, I guess, right?
Yeah, they're followed by the idea that in every generation, the art house kind of has a different movement. So for the sort of 20s generation, and then you suddenly have the GI generation coming back. Later, the art house will mean something to the boomers. It'll mean something to my Gen X generation. Every generation kind of rediscovers the importance of the art house theater. And it follows and tracks with the changes of filmmakers and also the changes, as you said, of the money. Because as the business rises, the number of theaters grows. When the business contracts, when they see that people aren't interested, obviously some of those theaters, especially those who are sort of Johnny-come-latelys, who are very kind of, oh, this is a new place I can be, who aren't invested in that. So there are certain theaters like the Little Carnegie in New York, which last for decades because they're just known as a place for art, no matter what the trend or the kind of moment is. But yeah, so there's this boom that's happening in the 40s. And if you think about all the movements, right? Italian Neorealism, French New Wave, Japanese art cinema, Czech New Wave, and Cinema Novo, you name it, those 2 decades that happen after the war, they will track they'll track through the biggest boom time that happens for post-war art cinema. And that's where you see they're not just now in cities, but you've got college towns across the nation. And so art houses are growing in the college areas. And again, that tracks with the boomers and kind of the sensibility.
Well, plus you had that whole college exhibition circuit.
And
but maybe we'll save that.
Yeah.
Talk about the Hays office and the production code.
Right.
And these very daring films that Hollywood was making in the 30s.
Yep.
In terms of subject matter.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, a fairly antiseptic, I mean, still great movies, but that compared with foreign films.
Well, I mean, with the coming of sound, the Hays Office really gets involved in censorship even more. They'd already been involved, obviously, with the PCA and making sure that you had submitted scripts beforehand, that they were going to be in line with the production code. In the early 30s, from 1930 to 1934, which is often called pre-code films, that's a world where you see a lot of female agency, but you also see a lot of gangsters. You see a lot of sexually suggestive material. You see a lot of material that would come off of American screens by 1934. So one of the appeals, of course, with the art house is that there's going to be European sensibility, not American sensibility. You're going to have a more risque affair. This comes into play, of course, in the 1960s, where European films become almost synonymous with more sexual material.
Right, the less puritanical kind of
thinking. By then the production code is on its way out in the 1960s, but it is where you would get I Am Curious Yellow and Immoral Mr. T's, and so you suddenly get these kind of films that are coming from Europe that have a lot more sexual material. But in the 30s, the attraction, again, of that is that you could actually be very political. There are all kinds of things in the production code and that basically say you can't attack certain nationalities or countries. You can't have certain kind of critiques. They're very clear about making, again, as we talked about before, a very universal product that would play to all the seats in the Capitol.
Yeah.
Right. And so once you have material that is coming from outside, you can bring that in. And it did go against, there were very famous cases around censorship that were happening in the 1950s and earlier around material. So there was an attraction to the art house and that it was going to be harder hitting and harder hitting around. That's one of the reasons people saw Open City was because you could see, things that were dramatized in Best Years of Our Lives, but you could just really see it in the fact that they went into location shooting for Rossellini's films. You could actually see the devastated countryside and not one that had been, sort of created in Hollywood. And so there was definitely an interest in what art house films could get you in sensibility and in tone and also in depiction that Hollywood films, until about 1967, till the new Hollywood comes in, and increasingly you're starting to see, Bonnie and Clyde, you start to see, violence returns and graphic violence and nudity and sexuality returns en masse.
One of the things that we talk about, obviously, in Laemmle Theatres is how your grandfather had started to introduce, the French New Wave and some Italian movies, to the audiences here in Los Angeles, and obviously sort of built a core audience due to his European sensibility, and obviously in this case his sort of awareness that there was a sort of a built-in audience who people wanted something else. You said that your grandfather brought a film under his arm when he came here the first time.
Well, his first idea was, yes, we're going to run theaters, but we're also, I'd like to distribute film.
Yeah.
And he probably bought a French sex comedy, which probably would have been something that wouldn't have been allowed otherwise under the, and there was, the production code was on production. It wasn't necessarily about censoring. There weren't censors of content, so you could show.
There was.
I mean, there was probably some. There was some stuff, obviously.
Yeah, it's
because there's community. What is the community standard?
Yeah. So Pasadena, for instance, here in Los Angeles, Pasadena had its own censorship board. Chicago had censorship boards. So there were local censorship boards which could outright make sure you couldn't show a certain film in that town. Films like even a film like Rashomon, I believe, was banned in Pasadena because it's a depiction of sexual assault.
Yeah.
So there were films that they didn't think were for the community. So it's interesting that there are, and we have this even today. There are certain places in the United States where some films just won't play. But for the most part, it's a national open.
Sometimes it's in your leases or something like
exactly.
that. Exactly. In many cases.
Yeah, and it used to be with newspaper advertising. If it was
that would be a factor as well.
Yep. If it was an X or an NC-17, you couldn't run newspaper advertising.
I grew up in L.A. and read the paper and never saw an ad for a porno film. And all of a sudden I go to college in Berkeley and, and you're like, look, there's ads, the Mitchell Brothers Theaters are advertising in the freaking newspaper. What's going on here?
Yeah.
But that was,
No.
I guess the only national really thing, my father talked about or one of my father's friends would say he would go to to church, Catholic church on Sunday, and he would hear the priest railing against the film that my father was playing.
Well, the Legions of Decency, which was the national Catholic organization, was very clear about what you should and shouldn't see. And Hollywood was always, one of the reasons the Hayes administration was there was to navigate all of these cultural factors that were happening all around the country. And specifically, the whole of Philadelphia, for instance, the movie-going in Philadelphia was damaged by the Catholic Church's upset about what was showing and movies being played on Sunday. And so there's a whole other world of that. And in a way, to go back to the art house theaters, that's what art house theaters gave you, was that they were less concerned about this material.
Sort of a respite. It wasn't mainstream in that sense. It was sort of a corner of the world.
Yeah. And remember that it's within an ecosystem of movies. Movies were suddenly playing in cineclubs and in museums and in guilds and workers, film and photo league. You had all kinds of different parties that were involved in showing film. So film was less homogenous than it is today. We had an entire nation of ethnic theaters. We had Japanese language theaters, Spanish language theaters, German language theaters, Yiddish language theaters. We had theaters for every ethnic group that lasted well into, here in Los Angeles, we had Spanish language theaters until the end of the 1990s. Yeah. So it was
I discovered Hong Kong film because of the theaters in the San Gabriel Valley.
Yeah, exactly. And they were like out in Alhambra. They were films that were absolutely Hong Kong films. So, that's a whole other not weird, but kind of interesting crossover that a film like Water for Chocolate would play both potentially at the Laemmle and it would also play at a Spanish language movie house downtown. Yeah. That a Hong Kong film might play again at a Laemmle, would also play at a Chinese theater out in San Gabriel Valley, which was that there were some films which would play, and that's a very distinct difference in the early periods, 20s, 30s, 40s, where you had all these ethnic theaters, but there were German films were often playing differently for German audiences, say in like Yorkville in New York. Those were very different kinds of German language theaters than German films that would play in an art house. What films they were, what the meaning of those films were, whether they were potentially pro-Nazi or not. The whole sensibility around it's why I think everything's so important to talk about theaters in a way is that it's the context. Who is the audience? Who's booking it? Who's curating it? What's the message of the booking? And what's the idea of that experience? Some of these are more nationalistic. So when you think about Japanese movie houses, which were here in Los Angeles, they were for the farmers who would come in to trade. They would get a piece of the home. They'd have benshi. But then when you would show Japanese films to an art house, they weren't getting an ethnic, nostalgic, diasporic experience. They were getting an art house experience in which you understand what Japanese cinema looks like, and you get to see films from a foreign land and have a conversation.
Right. Plays differently, different audience.
The film is different than the context. And it's why seeing the Mona Lisa on your computer screen is so different than going to the Louvre. It's just a different way of seeing the art. So
art house cinema, in a way, is a definition of an alternative to more mainstream Hollywood movies. And it is programmed, and obviously that audience is nurtured through all of these different sort of.
Yeah, I think Hollywood and American culture is so interesting because we're so driven by marketing and messaging. It's like when someone says, "Oh, it's an indie label." Remember when music was like, it's an indie band, and then you find out it's like Sub Pop and it's owned by Geffen, which is owned by, it's like, and we used to talk about all these indie studios, and it's like, oh, you mean, Focus owned by this one and Miramax owned by Disney. So we talk about independent cinema, but we don't mean independent cinema. It means something to us. An art house means something to us. It doesn't mean that it isn't a sacred place, an art house. An art house theater to me means something different than an art house film, because as you said, it could be foreign, it could be experimental, it could be independent, it could be truly independent, it could have a different sensibility. Art house kind of holds all of these cultural markers and meanings to us. And I think all of us approach it differently. Some people think it's like kind of one of those like, long hair things, where you just feel like that's only for the elites. And some of us feel like that's where the hard hitting stuff happens. That's where the real conversation is. And so all of us come to it differently. It's meant to give a signifier. It's meant to be that it's for, again, typically self-selected people who see film as art, who are interested in film as culture, who see the whole communal aspect of it. Like, I'm supposed to be here in this theater. I'm in the lobby talking about what we're about to see, and then we're quiet as a mouse in here to appreciate what the filmmakers wanted to bring to us. And then we go outside into the lobby and talk about it. We go to a coffee shop or a restaurant or bookstore and talk about it some more. Right. We don't go into the mall and then buy the action figure that comes from that movie.
Right. And it's not that manufactured product.
Right. It's
as good as those things may be,
right.
But it's not,
and that comes back
to a different sensibility.
Yeah, and that comes back
contrary,
to the marketing way that was done. So if you go back to Cinema 5 and Don Rugoff, and you go back to other Walter Reed and other big distributors of the era, and then later Sony Pictures Classics and Miramax and Searchlight, building this also was around the auteur, around the director. And so branding these films was also really important. It was a Rene, it was a Truffaut, a Godard. It's that they were part of the art house ecosystem. And so you also get this meaning that this is not a mainstream director per se. This is an art house director, but sometimes there's crossover. Mm-hmm. The crossover is the really interesting conversation.
Yeah, well, Truffaut making Mississippi Mermaid with for Warner Brothers with Belmondo and Deneuve, and it's in French, but it's almost a mainstream film.
Yeah. I mean, Contempt is almost a mainstream film, I mean, for me.
Well, I think the producer thought it was going to be.
That's a problem. If you're shooting that high.
We'll go.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's this sense of, and I think art house has also changed. That's why I go back to the little cinemas where the sensibility is different. The mid-century art house is different. I think art house today, and Greg, you would know that better than anyone. We have this weird cataloging system that all the streamers do. They'll throw up these genres that have never existed. I mean, home video stores always had a strange cataloging system, but I kind of understood it. Like, this is thrillers, this is horrors. Now it's like art house films that also are from Germany, or art house films that also have ladders. I mean, it's like I'm joking a little bit, but there are strange categorizations that I think art house now doesn't mean coming into a theater like this necessarily. They're telling you this is art house films on our platform.
Right. And of course, the thing that is so defining about an art house theater is the curation, right? Because the issue that I have with streamers, obviously, other than obviously the availability, and there's wonderful films that have been discovered are now available, et cetera, is in a lot of cases, if you don't know them, then you can't find them.
Right.
And how do you there's a wonderful sort of element of discovery that happens when you walk into it, like, what's this? This is interesting. Like, this is a movie from Iran, and I don't know this filmmaker, but I hear good things. And you walk in, you're like, oh my God, look at this. And so something about coming to a distinct location that that has been curated to, again, define kind of, I guess you say, sort of something off that's not just in the cultural conversation, but is, obviously has a deeper way of looking at things and really sort of considers a sort of a wider canvas.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't have to tell you, I mean, we're sitting here with Greg Laemmle. It's part of the thing is that you're understanding that Greg and his team are involved in booking these films. They're watching them in advance, they're talking to filmmakers, they're taking the temperature of things. You trust that. The whole notion, if there's any real cohesive notion in a way for me for art house theaters for the last 100 years, is that the brand is the theater, and the brand is sometimes the booker programmer, and the brand is the director. And those things are the conversation. I go, people would just say, I'm going to go to the Little Carnegie because they would always show you something great. You just trust that. It's not as driven now as we are now, like, well, it's Deadpool. We're driven by the idea that I don't know this film from Iran. I don't know this film from Canada, but it's playing at the Laemmle. That means that
it's got to be good, right?
Yeah, it means you watched it and you know it's right for this audience, and that's trust. That engagement is what's paramount of the last 100 years between whether it was Simon Gould or Don Rugoff or Greg Laemmle. So the idea is that you are believing in the people who are booking this.
Sort of a sacred trust.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and that's often what happens when things break down. Typically with distributors is when they're away from their audience. They're not figuring out it. They've lost their audience somehow. They moved into an area, and they haven't found it. Or when the audience just escapes them, which is kind of what happened with Cinema 5. That just the art house economics collapsed. And it became more challenging.
That can happen. The other challenges, of course, were many cases the victims of our own success, because other exhibitors look at it and say, well, it's just putting film through a projector. We do that.
Yeah.
And how did we not play the film that grossed X? Right. So we want the next one. And they put pressure on distributors, of course, because especially if there's circuits and we're going to give you so much support for this film.
Yeah.
And the film falls flat on its face because
Well, I also think that's the difference between, because a lot of and I won't name any, but a lot of mainstream exhibitors will book art house product.
Sure.
They'll even say they have one screen dedicated to art house. So those are art house films. Is it an art house experience? And that's a difference. And I think that's also what's different.
And I don't want to, poo-poo that, because in some cases it's providing access for those films to an audience.
Yeah.
Right.
In a case where it's an art house desert. But yeah.
But does it?
It's a challenge, because I think distributors, diminish the value of what the art house provides to their film in terms of launching it.
Yeah.
And that's, but we go through those cycles. That's fine. At its height, put the context of an art house hit in terms of admissions next to whatever the big Hollywood hit was that year. If we're in the 60s, how does Z?
1969, yeah.
Right, compare to, another successful commercial film of that year in terms of number of admissions.
If you're the distributor of Z.
Or gross even.
Yeah.
Yeah,
which I think was Cinema 5.
Yes, it was.
You're happy with Z. You're very happy with Z. Z is not going to give you money like other major markets. Mm-hmm. It's going to do well, but you would not want to match up Z's box office typically with a major motion picture from 1969.
No, I suppose not. But I and maybe this is something.
I can't quote dollars.
This is something for further study, I guess,
Sure.
because I would say it was a bigger percentage of national box office, a bigger percentage or closer to what some of those films did. Because what happens 72, 73 is blockbuster Hollywood films become just massive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know what you would consider the first really, huge blockbuster, whether it's Exorcist or Jaws. I mean, Jaws, of course, changes. I mean, it's probably Jaws is the release pattern.
It's a really
the wide release summer film.
Well, you can watch it because it's like going from Love Story to Godfather to Exorcist, Godfather 2, Jaws. I mean, there's a trajectory in there, and they're all based on they're interesting, because almost all of those, especially from Godfather to Jaws, they're all based on a book, and they're all pre-sold concepts that have built-in audiences and built-in awareness that are also built on the backs of a well-read public that loves these.
What's that?
Yeah, we used to have one of those, and so it's a different, right? It's a different sensibility. That's a different world, the 1970s, even than the one today. So when we talk about blockbusters, we're not thinking about superheroes.
No, but still the economics have changed in a way where all of a sudden, Z is a box office hit. And it's not a box office hit compared to whatever the highest grossing Hollywood film there is. But it's, the difference between what Z does and what this does is not the same as the difference, No,
there's a thermonuclear change that begins to happen in 75. You have the first wide release. Jaws goes out in about 100 screens. And that doesn't sound like a lot today. It's a huge amount. And they backed it with a TV campaign, which had never been done before. Because you would never need a national TV campaign if you're only platforming a movie into 25 screens, as Star Wars was, right? So they did a national TV campaign. They had a national rollout. It felt like a major cultural event. These is the mass market movie. Mass market, yeah. Whereas Z is going to be
Star Wars, of course.
Right. So Z is a thermonuclear event in cities. It's a thermonuclear event for a smaller subsection of the country, but it is one that's going to show up in magazines and newspapers, and it's going to be on talk shows. It will have a conversation. And to your point, you're right. It's not so different than you would get a few years later when you'd get, like, say, the difference in dollars, which is a big hit, Last Tango in Paris, but between Last Tango in Paris and Jaws. There's a huge differential.
Divide starts to
and that divide spread. Obviously after Star Wars becomes even bigger, and then you off to the races, with Star Trek and Empire Strikes Back and E.T. and that world that you're never going.
And now you're starting to watch, and now the public is watching the numbers.
Because Entertainment Tonight and Hollywood had an interest in talking about box office, and they had it was a marketing move to essentially put box office numbers in the minds, because we're sports fans.
Sports scores,
we're sports fans, right? So it's like who wins and who loses after a weekend also became part of the box office conversation, which was a dangerous game that was played, and you can't unring the bell. And now we have a sensibility. And so you also get this on the art house level. You get that to the per screen average conversation, whereas you're making sure you get your per screen average, because that has a whole other conversation. And that means, well, look at that per screen average. I got to book it. But if you book it in too many places, you don't get a per screen average, right? So you're in a conversation. So we're all, because we live in a capitalist country, we are paying attention to money because that is how it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so we're all paying attention to the numbers.
Well, whether we're paying attention to it or not, the fact is the media is paying attention to it.
Exactly.
So now that's what's driving the conversation more than is it a good film or not.
I heard it's a hit, right?
Yeah.
Well, you just hit the nail on the head, because that's the conversation of the 1970s and the 1960s, was the conversation about, is it culture and value and engagement and discovery, relevance. There's that whole, Sidney Pollack has a great line in, I can't remember which documentary it is, and he says, basically, in the old days, it was about the film's immediacy to you. Now it's about how far away the film is from you. In other words, that the superhero is the furthest from you, but when you're in the 60s and 70s, you wanted a film that spoke to your immediate experience. It was actually one of the reasons why the art house foreign films began to decline, because American audiences actually wanted to hear about their world, about the protest movements and about anti-war, and they wanted to hear more about their world versus someone else's. But it's a larger cultural point.
Anyway, I bring it up only because I think there's something to be said that the art house audience is not shrunk. It's just shrunk in perspective to the mass market Hollywood audience, which is, box office.
And that's the thing. Yeah, you're right. If you just could keep people away from the idea of thermonuclear numbers, you would see that there's a continuum from the 20s all the way through. It's always been engaged, self-selected, urban, but it's also always been passionate. But passionate doesn't excite Wall Street. What excites Wall Street is year-over-year annual returns, right? So they want to see exponential growth. They don't want to see 10%. They need 100%.
So indie cinema did not begin in 1989 with the release of Sex, Lies, and Videotape.
Amazing.
It's great a film. I love it. Fabulous.
Wait a minute.
We're celebrating, as you said, 100 years of Art House. We're also celebrating this year the 50th anniversary of A Woman Under the Influence. John Cassavetes. Not his first film, but his first self-distributed film. But talk about even, when does indie cinema start?
This is such a complicated conversation I'm trying to make short, which is that I think in a way, especially in the early Hollywood or not early cinema, most things were independent.
Okay.
There wasn't a vertically integrated system.
Correct. Yeah,
so, I mean, if you really think about Hollywood, we're talking typically about 8 companies, and independent film has always been part. I mean, it's Monogram, an independent film. We've had these small studios. Small studios. Yeah. Those are independents. They're kind of like the Lionsgate of now. They were always independent. So we've always had.
But indie art house maybe.
So indie art house, there were distributors in the 1920s of independent cinema, specifically foreign films. There were always independent distributors as long as there's been film.
Okay, right.
So the indie, again, we go back to this conversation, what does independent mean? I see indie cinema as a kind of confection of 80s, 90s sensibility. The conversations around art house are different than indie. It became a value.
Right.
Basically,
I don't
oppositional value.
Okay.
Yeah.
But let's say filmmaker taking a camera, making a movie.
Yeah. Well, there was also the notion of amateur, right? So there was always amateur cinema, and there were self-distributed films. There were non-theatrical films. There were films made by, again, clubs, amateur clubs, filmmaking clubs, guilds that were always interested. Some of those were left-wing groups, socialist groups, progressive groups, union groups. They were religious groups. So there's always been filmmaking from everybody under the sun. It's been local foreign language, but also what we would call foreign language, but here in the United States, making films that were outside the Hollywood mainstream system. There's been film outside the Hollywood mainstream system since there's been Hollywood, and there's been so. I know I don't think I'm dodging the question. But I'm sort of trying to say that there's this notion of independent cinema is something that is very important to the American industry because it denotes something.
Well, I guess obviously what happens with that brand of indie is that it becomes repetitive.
Yeah.
So in another conversation we've had, that someone sees the success of A Woman Under the Influence and says, well, I'm not able to sell my film Hester Street.
Right.
So I'm just, but look what he did.
Yeah.
I'm going to self-release Hester Street.
Yeah.
And so it's not the first success, but it's when you can start seeing 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 of these things happening that it becomes, if not something that an audience can rely on, at least it's something that an audience is familiar with or can.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, it's in the same way that it's not just a French film. There's a whole series of French films and French filmmakers and not that we can follow.
Yes, and there's always
another Bergman film.
Yeah, there's always been governmental subsidies outside the U.S. Governmental subsidies, production companies, distributors, local distributors. In the old days, states' rights distributors. The distribution apparatus of the United States has always been very complex, very regimented, but also very distinct in terms of being what's a Hollywood contract, which is all the independent contracts that can be created for these kinds of films. To your point, when somebody starts distributing things in a self-distributed way that's outside of the mainstream, it does feel unique because we're more used to the idea that even an industry distributor picks up a film, you get a sales agent, you get a distributor to make that content, to distribute that content for you. But it's been going on, honestly, since the start of the film business.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think again, this is why independent is such a charged and challenged word in the American context, because it sort of sets up like, if it's not these, again, 8 studios back in the day, then everything else is independent. But in a way, when Fox was not vertically integrated, he was an independent. And I don't have to tell you that Carl Laemmle was an independent. So it's
absolutely. Like without a chain of theaters.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So it's sort of like independent is marshaled in different ways in different periods.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, from a filmmaker's point of view, being independent means that you can actually sort of make your vision without having to be tied to kind of an infrastructure or a studio system that determines or directs, navigates the direction of the tone, of the texture, the choices of the film. It gives you more kind of creative autonomy, right?
Also, independent's interesting because it suggests that you are outside of a system.
None of us are outside of a system, and unless you want to put a sheet up in your bed in your living room, and
right. And again,
you're ultimately going to be relying on somebody,
right? And so, if you're engaged in a need for commerce to repay investors or to even just to defray your own costs, you're involved in the system. Yeah. So, independence is codependence in many cases.
Yeah. You also get those weird ones where you can have indie but not art house. So like Dolomite. But then you come to Sweetbacks, and it's like, well, wow, that's a little bit of everything.
Well, even my Big Fat Greek Wedding was kind of like an independent, was at a Playtone, but it was like, is that an art house film? It certainly played at art houses, but is it an art house film? What makes that is a different conversation. What makes something an art house film? And we all have our own sensibility. You certainly must have one, but it's a different sensibility. It's kind of a rom-com. It's kind of an ethnic rom-com that exploded. I mean, I know certain theaters in the country that booked it because someone else didn't and ran that movie for like 28, 50 weeks. Yeah. Their whole year was built on My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And so as an indie hit, as an independent film, sort of outside the system, although with some big players behind it, it made a ton of money. Yeah. But is it an art house film? Depends on your art house, I guess. So is
that just sort of what leg you're leaning on, I guess?
I mean, it might play in an art house theater, doesn't make it an art house film. This is I guess an existential question about what makes something art house.
Right.
I find everything to be a certain kind of it's a gesture, it's a move, it's a brand, it's a messaging, it's a promotion. You're sending on a sensibility. It doesn't mean that an art house theater has an aesthetic, it has a booking strategy, it has a feeling, it has an audience, it has a core, it has a program, it has a whole line of things. But if I just say it's art house film, that often to me seems subjective.
That's getting really tricky.
Yeah. And that's where I think it's like, and I don't blame people for using
the content, and you said it. A lot of it's about the context.
Yeah.
What makes Hong Kong action cinema, John Woo, Cho Hark, what makes those films art house?
Yeah.
In part because you couldn't see them anywhere else.
Yeah.
And they were certainly very different and completely enjoyable.
Yeah. I mean, Chungking Express, people talk about its influence in French New Wave and many other independent, kind of art movements. So it feels like, well, that's an art film. It has an art sensibility. It's not trying to go for a mainstream.
But that's art cinema.
Right.
But an art house.
Right.
That could be something entirely different. And it could be something entirely different from what is playing Saturday matinee to the prime show on Saturday night to what is playing at midnight.
Yep.
I mean, when does the midnight circuit start?
That's really 1970s. It's, I mean, big midnight, I mean, it's growing in the 60s, but really the 70s movement when you get, again, Rocky Horror Picture Show and Pink Flamingos. And a lot of that is, coming out of the kind of the switch in the 70s, which was to go back to a lot of rep. And to do a lot of calendaring, right? So when you do this kind of 2 a day, you're doing calendar functions. So you're doing like a lot of rep, a lot of cult. And so cult cinema becomes big in the 70s, and then the midnight screenings. And of course, Rocky Horror Picture Show has been going now, we're almost at 50 years. And so that becomes a whole other part of what an art house. So what you just said, midnight screenings at an art house are different. They bring out a different crowd because it's a flexible space. This space means something different for college students than it means for seniors, than it means for a cult audience crowd. It's a flexible space so that's what I mean. The art house theater kind of enwraps and brings everyone in to an understanding that the film is going to have a certain kind of meaning. I mean, the person who runs the theater has to think about the money, but the person who's coming here is thinking about the meaning of this, what's being transacted. I can watch Rocky Horror Picture Show at home. It has no engagement to me that it's supposed to have when I come to the theater. I can watch a Nora at an art house with an art house crowd. It's going to be completely different than if I go see it somewhere else. It's just a different conversation. We're going to have different people, different sensibility. You're going to feel it in the room,
right?
Because it's within an art house context.
It's interesting now for us. So here we are, basically, we've sort of done this, committed to doing this podcast, having these conversations with people whose films are opening. They are some repertory, reissues of classic films, but mostly films that are opening now, this week or next week or a month out. And basically if I were to sort of say for the, 10, 12 people, I mean, we're still early days here, right? but the 10 or 12, filmmakers that we've spoken to, there is a personal vision that defines their ability to strike into sort of a perhaps nonlinear, perhaps, not within a system, not really. There's a commitment to making a good movie that's not defined by the money. And yet I'm aware of the fact that the money is obviously what drives it. It was saying, going all the way back. But there is a personal.
I don't think the money drives it. I think, obviously they want to make another movie, but I think the money represents an audience at some level, and people getting to see it and appreciating it.
Well, Paul Thomas Anderson, Licorice Pizza, had this big premiere at the Village.
Right.
It's an art house film. It was basically almost an art house crowd. It wasn't an art house theater, but it drew that crowd because it was curated that way. It was marketed, positioned that way. It's a selected, exclusive engagement of people who are PTA fans who want to have this kind of moment. So you can grab onto that experience. You can get it, but you won't find it consistently at those places. So there's, in terms of people who care about the money, again, slight cynicism. There's a privilege to just being like, my producer and backers will deal with it. I'm off to make my film. Some filmmakers are very clear about the idea that they know that if they don't make money here, they don't make another one. Some filmmakers are, they really talk about the fact of, I don't get involved in that. And that's okay. But the fact of the matter is that almost from the day this business began, you have to make some money, because no one will book your next one. No one will finance the next one. So I think it's
Well, that's an interesting distinction about European cinema, because a lot of it, or any time you have cinema that is government funded,
yep,
you have the potential that the people making these decisions are not responding to to an audience.
Yeah.
They're responding to their friends. They're responding, who knows what they're responding to. And while I decry the lack of, funding for the arts in the United States, it does force filmmakers to confront their audience.
Yes.
And the more creative ones of them, adjust their budget then to say, well, this is the film I want to make. This is the story. And I'm going to take whatever resources I have or whatever I expect to get back, but I'll make sure that, I'm still standing to make another film.
You make a great point, which is that, the European film and many film makers around the world work with government backing, and they work with some public support money, which means that, and whether it's tax credits or whether it's financing, it means that they're not beholden but they are certainly aware that they are important to those funding agencies. They're important to messaging some kind of idea. There's a lot of conversation about the French New Wave, that there was a very concerted effort of the French government to push a whole brand new line of cinema into the world at a time when the kind of the cinema du papa movement of the 50s was kind of declining, that they understood this kind of new wave cinema, the kind of new sensibility around France would come through its cinema as a foreign export, the way you would almost have with a new bottle of champagne.
It's a cultural thing.
It was a cultural export.
We want to win prizes.
We want France to be relevant in the cultural framework around the world. And so that's a very different idea than an individual filmmaker who goes to their producer and says, I want to make this film because I think next time, I want to be able to make another film. It's a different idea than being part of a kind of cultural export regime.
That sort of leads us up to, I guess, the moment, which is where, I guess, and we don't have probably another hour to talk about it, but essentially, where are we now and where are we going, I guess, is the question.
From my perspective, we are in an interesting moment where any one of two things or 10 things could happen. Every generation typically finds their moment to go back to the art house. So this is a moment where we're now waiting for Gen Z to understand why this is so important. Their time may come. It's coming along slowly because they unfortunately were growing up out of the post-college world. For a lot of them was in the pandemic, but they will come back to this. If history is a guide, Gen Z will return to the art house because they will be the drivers of the next art house. They'll be like the boomers drove that. And then my generation, Gen X, did. 60s wave of art house cinema, and and your generation drove that indie wave. Yep, and they will tell the distributors what they want. Yeah, and that's the organic way that it should work. That, in other words, a new generation needs to come in, understand why it's so important to sit here without their phone and stare at that screen. And when they do that, they'll tell you by box office, this is where money does matter, what they're watching. And distributors and exhibitors will look at that and say, we'll make more of these and we'll program more of that. And that will make a difference, because I don't think I'm talking, Greg, you could tell me if I'm wrong. I worry about where the senior citizen audience, which used to be a big driver of art houses, especially during the day, they seem to have evacuated this experience, some during COVID, some obviously just attrition, and some of it just because they got out of the habit. And so that's challenging because that was a big driver. So that means that my generation is retiring in the next 10, 20 years. They're going to be seniors and they'll probably still love to go to art houses, so they'll be back for that. Yeah. But I am determined that the Gen Z and Gen Alpha are the people who will have to return here. But you're talking about a massive cultural question. Yeah. Is, can you get these people off their phones? Can you get them out of their house? And the part of the problem is, if you're at home doing remote work, the whole point of the art house back in the day was, up on 57th Street and 58th Street in New York, Manhattan, was a huge swath of art house theaters. If you live in the Upper West, you're in Lincoln Center. There was all these art houses. Right. Yeah, so you could walk out of your Midtown office, go get a drink, and then go see a movie, and then go to dinner or whatever afterwards. So it was just easy. Even here in LA, I'm on the way home, I'll stop at the Royal, see something, and then I'll head home. If you're already at home and you've been in your PJs all day or whatever it might be, your athleisure, I guess that's the new PJs, and you're at home in your athleisure Zooming all day, do you want to get dressed somewhat to go out to the theater? And so this is a challenge, and they need to feel the desire. Now, Amazon and others are forcing them back to the office, so maybe strangely it'll force people to want to go to movie theaters on the way home. But I think there's an existential challenge to every retail, restaurant, business, which is just people out instead of in.
Instead of everything coming to them.
Coming to them.
That's right. Well, yeah, but that's impacting retail. Yep. Obviously, it's impacting restaurants. Yep. Because people, I don't want to go out, just I'm going to have Uber Eats bring me the food. Yeah.
They need to find. But I think
we're going to get tired of that. But
yes,
when I guess is the question.
Probably soon. I feel like, I don't know. I have this strange feeling that at some point there'll be a sick of my phones movement. Yeah.
Totally.
Totally. But COVID was certainly a meteor hitting the earth, and we're still feeling the reverberations. Yeah. So I think trying to understand exactly where we are in a process of recovery is hard to do. Yeah. But I personally have the faith that we are in a process of recovery, and. But
what works is,
the audience will build back, and it will, it'll just be different.
It's that scene again, the famous Annie Hall scene of people online, and this guy's spitting on my neck, and that whole scene online at the Beekman. It's like that. You need that culture. That's what the 20s and the 40s, 50s, and 60s, all the way to today has been. Is that this has to be a place for people to come together. If you're devoted in focusing on content versus context, you're missing it, because you can get content anywhere.
Right.
The context is everything.
Well, there was a time when you couldn't get content.
Right.
Now you can.
Now you can, which means that the only meaning
so
you
the
can
content
put is what's here. It's by people you talk to. Bring 3 of your friends. Meet people while you're here. Have a conversation. That engagement is what this is about. If we've lost that, and in our culture, we kind of look like we have, but if we've lost that, we have a larger problem than even art house theaters. We have a human problem. I believe intrinsically, because I see it every day when I work with students, when they sit and they watch movies, they realize how amazing it is to not be plugged in, to be tuned out, but on screen. So I'm convinced that there's a world for that. And you see it all the time, because there's always some thermonuclear event in movie going where everyone's going to this for 3 weeks. I mean, Barbenheimer and Taylor Swift was the best examples of that. But I've seen that even on the art house, where suddenly just some film, everyone's talking about it, you can't get a seat. And that's when
it's a sensation.
Yeah. And that's what brings people back. And then you got to pick up the habit. So the problem has been in the last few years is the lack of titles. The lack of titles means you don't get people in, which means you can't market to them for the next thing, and they get out of the habit. Yeah. And the habit has to come back in. And it doesn't matter if it's commercial, mainstream cinemas, or it's art house, the habit. The habit, though, here is different. The habit here has to be, I talked to people, I had this experience, I met these people, we went out and talked about this. Or I don't care if they hated something. That means they had a feeling about it, We used to have a whole
Thank
world.
God they walked out.
Yeah, they hated it. That's great. And they'll never be back. No, but we used to have a whole world where film critics mattered.
Yeah, well, we don't have film critics.
Yeah, we got a couple of people pay attention to, but I think that's part of the challenge too. Was that there was an ecosystem around this whole thing that was about that film was culture and that taste, and there was a kind of critique. And if you saw something or didn't see something, we knew something about you, and you hadn't seen it yet, and you were just desperate to see it. There was this whole anxiety. And it was anxiety. It was anxiety if someone would love your film, or if you were able to would you be able to get a seat? Could you get a ticket? Could you see it? Would someone like it as much as you? Would you mesh with that person because they didn't like that movie, like it changed your whole world? Like when film rocks someone's sensibility and their world, it buries deep inside them.
Right, it changes their DNA.
It changes their DNA. And then talking to somebody else who doesn't understand, it's like you can't even go on a date with that person. You don't know what to say. It's your favorite film.
Right, like I never saw it.
This isn't going to, well, that's better than I saw it and I hated everything about it. It's like almost, like, that's like they should put on dating profiles. Like you can't, that's it. You know? And so I feel like that film has to mean that. And it has to mean that when it happens here. And I don't know about you, but like if I sit at home, and it's no knock on anyone, but if I sit at home and I pause it, go to the bathroom and get something in the kitchen and go back and play it again with one of the person in the room, it could be a great film. I don't know if it's going to be a great experience.
Yeah. I mean, to look to, again, and I've said this before, but just the fact that these theaters are still thriving and doing well, and that you've been able to kind of figure out a way to make it work. Obviously, it was not easy, and remains, complicated. It's so important. And we, in the intent of wanting to do this, want to continue to celebrate art house film, people going to movies, people seeing movies in theaters. And in the, if you build it, they will come. They'll find their way here, they'll find their way back. And
that's why the history is so important, though. I mean, I think because we live in a strange age where I find that like lack of historical knowledge on all elements of our society is part of the problem. But I think part of the problem now too is that lack of understanding that this is 100-year art house, little cinemas, sure-seaters, art house
Walter Reed Circuit, you name it.
You name it. Walter Reed,
whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, all that. This 100 years of business, it has had ebbs and flows. It has cratered and risen. It will continue to do that. And I think some of that, and that has to do with the film business, just the confidence of knowing that culture changes, desires change, consumers change, generations change, but they return when they find the importance of what this place is. Mm-hmm. And this place is because it brings something to them and people to them that they can't find anywhere else.
Thank you, Russ.
Amen. Amen.
The show's not called Inside Laemmle, it's called Inside the Arthouse. So wherever you are, find your local art house, support it, become a fan, become a regular attendee, and Let's have a great second century.
There you go.
Get thee to an art house. Yes, right.
For its 100th anniversary next year.
Yeah, wonderful. Ross, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So appreciate
Pleasure.
it. Thank you.
Inside the Arthouse was produced by Miles McCreary, Thomas Cassetta, and Raphael Sbarge, and our on-site producer is Noreen Dickerson, and filmed at the Laemmle Royal Theatre. The episode was edited by Gabriel Laemmle, show open edited by Rick Pratt, music by Isabel Engman and Gerardo Garcia Jr., graphics by Janet DeAngelis, marketing by Stephanie Peters and Matthew King. Find out more at InsideTheArthouse.com.